Everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So, this is the cover of actually a two-in-one, because Wings of Pegasus is a book that was published with the two books that are chronologically the first two of the Anne McCaffrey's Talent series. There is a third, but it was published many, many moons after both To Ride Pegasus and Pegasus in Flight, which are the first two. The Talent series actually comes in two parts. You have the initial trilogy, To Ride Pegasus, Pegasus in Flight, and Pegasus in Space. And then after that, you have the separate follow-up Talent series, which takes place a couple hundred years later, which begins with the Rowan, followed by Damia, Damia's Children, Lion's Pride, and the last book, which I can't recall offhand because it's been a very long time since I've reread these. These were books that loomed large in my youth. I was a big Anne McCaffrey fan back in the day. I have become less so over time, but Anne McCaffrey remains one of the trailblazers of the sci-fi fantasy for women in sci-fi and fantasy. She remains one of the premier names of it and stands as somebody who opened the way in very particular ways. There are parts of her books that are admittedly problematic from the modern perspective, but it's very, very important to remember that these are books that she started to write in the 1960s. Her book, her novella, rather, A Womanly Talent, which appears in the course of To Ride Pegasus, was published in 1969, as was Apple. And so the thing about, and so you're dealing with these books that are coming out of a very, very different era than we're in now. And so she's writing in that era and of that era, but there's very specific slants in terms of perspective that have to do with the fact that it is a woman writing at that time, things that have to do with how women are perceived, with particular aggravations and difficulties women have to deal with that do appear in some of these books, or rather books by Anne McCaffrey. But anyways, so let's move on. I had to dig this out from online because To Ride Pegasus, this is the cover of, I believe, the edition that I first borrowed from the library. So that's sort of my secondary default cover. My first default is, of course, my copy, which, as I said, is the twofer. But this is the other first cover. Now, To Ride Pegasus, again, keeping in mind that this is a book that was published in the 1960s, that it's the initial stages of publication were the 1960s. This is a book that was set in the then reasonably middling off future. That is, it was set in the 1990s, but this was the 1960s. The other thing about this book that should be noted before I go into more detail is that To Ride Pegasus is not a novel. To Ride Pegasus is a collection of novellas that have been strung together to tell a story, that they lack the connective tissue that you have in a novel that sort of precedes a story from one thing to the next thing to the next. What they are is a series of novellas in chronological order. Now, the premise of this series is that humans have psychic abilities, or at least that some humans have psychic abilities, they have those capabilities. And the idea is that as EEG technology, the sci-fi portion of this, as EEG technology was invented, improved, developed, suddenly the ability to actually tell when someone was having a telepathic, telekinetic, prescient, clairvoyant, what have you incident which incident is spelled with a capital I in these books, that it allowed people to say, yes, there is definable proof that there is a thing happening. And so the initial stage, and so what these books are, this book in particular is about the discovery that these are valid scientific things. These are not magic. These are not, woo-woo magic powers. These are scientifically verifiable, specific, and limited capabilities of people. And that somebody basically set out to create a Parapsychic Centre, to create a situation where talents would, A, be able to learn how to use their abilities, and B, because there is so much to abuse in telekinesis or telepathy, that they would be taught particular ethics, that they would have sort of an oversight to ensure that they didn't misuse things. And because of certain psychological demands required by telepaths, such as physical space from other people so that they don't, get overwhelmed by constantly being surrounded by people, they needed a certain amount of physical space and distance, and so they needed to create a particular setup within, for themselves in order to ensure that they would be, that these people wouldn't start to suffer psychological knock-on effects of constantly telepathically hearing the neighbors. So what happens in this is that you have the first novella, which is To Ride Pegasus, officially, and that novella is the story of Henry Darrow, who was the first director of the Parapsychic Centre, that he is a precognitive talent. That is, he has visions of the future. Now, again, in these books, the idea of precogs is, of course, very, very specific, very limited, and usually significantly short term. And the idea is that he is able to predict the future with certain specific limitations. And what he does is he sets out to create this Parapsychic Centre, and this is sort of the birthing pangs of developing it. The second, A Womanly Talent, is very much about, although this is, of course, in the second one as well, but there's a lot in these, in the first two in particular, which have to do with the legislative issues of dealing with people who have these abilities, with how you legislate them, with how you deal with them, about the fact that if a precognitive person is able to tell that something is going to explode, and so they warn people it's going to explode, and then people do things that prevent the explosion from happening, how do you avoid them getting sued when somebody says, well, nothing happened, so your warning was a waste of our money? That they needed to have immunity for talents in the same way that a great many professions, be they doctors or, and I know this is a sketchy thing to say right now, police officers, but there are a lot of professions that require a certain degree of professional immunity because there are things you are going to have to do within your profession that in any other case might be seen as careless or dangerous to others or what have you, but that you have to say there are margins of error and things that people are going to have to do within their jobs that mean that you cannot be allowing people to sue them or throw them in prison. You know, a doctor who makes a very, very genuine mistake in a medication dosage, this is somebody who, if they make a very specific and genuine error that anybody could make, you can't be having those people sued within an inch of their lives because humans are fallible. It's not fair, because then you're basically creating a situation where it's impractical for a doctor to ever function at all, because if they make any mistake, somebody could sue them or throw them in prison. Well, talents need the same sort of thing. So there's a lot of discussion about the legislation as it goes through. The second last one is about what happens when you get rogue talents. That Apple is in effect that the antagonist of it is a young woman who abruptly discovers that she has talent and then basically kind of goes on a rampage, stealing things and rampages across half the town when she gets scared because they didn't get to her in time, they didn't find her in time, and a bunch of things happened, and it's a tragedy. And our protagonist, Daffodop Owen, who is the second director of the center, Dave for short, because that's the Welsh extraction of David. I don't actually know if it gets pronounced David. It's one of those names where you look at it and you say, do the Welsh pronounce those two F's as a V? Is it actually just David spelled weird? Anyways, Owen is... Yeah, it's somebody out there actually understands Welsh pronunciations and is screaming at me. Anyways, he's the protagonist in the last three, and in this second one, he spends the whole time trying to track her down, sympathizing with her, feeling sorry for her, wanting to help her, but in the end, it just kind of all falls to pieces around him. The second one is them catching a young woman who has a lot of power, and they get to her before she turns into a tragedy. And those last two are kind of more about certain pragmatic issues that come from being on the ground, working with this center, trying to deal with their issues. So this book is a little... I enjoy it, and it's very, very nice to have an origin story, in particular when you read the Rowan, that this is sort of considered, this is something that you're supposed to look at and sort of see, this is how we get from where we are now to the Rowan. But it isn't a novel. It's a book with a collection of novellas in it, and so it's a little discombobulating to read because we don't have that connective tissue from one thing to the next. There are cross-references. They're not, you don't have each story existing in a vacuum. You have consistent characters from one to the next. But it is a little bit in pieces. So the interesting thing about this cover, of course, is this is a very heavy-duty sci-fi cover, and I actually don't know offhand who did this one, but this is a cover that's really trying to capture at least part of it, this idea of a future in which you start testing children to find out whether or not they have these psychic talents. And it's a very, very sci-fi cover, which, I'll be honest, stands very much in contrast with the later covers of the Rowan and onward, which are sci-fi, but they're much more pulp fiction-y than this. This is a very, very... Actually, it has a vague look of dystopia to it, which is problematic because, I'll be honest, there are things in the Pegasus trilogy that could be seen as dystopian, but they're not really meant to be. It's meant to be more looking at a world which has entered a state of overpopulation, as we have, that has spread out too much, that has too much inequality, and that has been desperately working at fixing the issues of inequality and has managed to fix certain of those issues, if not others. And it's an interesting world. It's a near future world that was supposed to have happened about 20 years ago, actually. So that's all I have to say about this first one. And I will see you all next week.